Hello, and welcome to Conversations with the Candidates. My name is Sarah Bartley. I am a resident of Beverly and a voter here, and I'm going to be your host for today. Really glad that you've made this time to get to know your candidates for Ward 6 City Council. I am sitting here today with Matt St. Hilaire. Hi, Matt.
Sarah, how are you?
Good. Really glad that you're making the time to share with voters. I just want to give you a little sense of where I'm going today. I was hoping we could start with some questions to help voters in Ward 6 get to know you better. Then we'll move into some questions more specific to issues in Beverly, in Ward 6 and across the city. And then we'll just close with hearing some of your priorities and your values and ideas that you're bringing. So
I look forward to it.
Sound good?
Yeah.
All right. So, to get started, why don't you just start by introducing yourself to any Ward 6 voters that haven't gotten to know you yet?
Sure. And first I'd like to thank BevCam and you, Sarah, for giving me the opportunity to get my message out. We've got an election coming up Tuesday, November 2nd, quickly approaching. My name is Matt St. Hilaire. I'm a candidate for the Ward 6 City Council seat to represent the residents of Beverly Farms, Centerville, and Bryant's Crossing. Running really for three reasons. First, passionate about public service and really care deeply about my community. Secondly, I think I have some pretty good experience to bring to the table to be an effective ward councilor for the residents. And really, thirdly, as a former city councilor at large, Ward 6 voters were my biggest supporters. And with John Frady's resignation last year, I received a lot of encouragement and support to throw my hat in the ring. And here I am. So looking forward to our conversation.
Sounds good. So, you've already mentioned the neighborhoods that make up Ward 6. It's actually a really big ward. So I wonder what you would say is the ward's biggest asset.
Biggest asset, I think, it's our community. It's our people that make up the residents of Ward 6. I grew up in Beverly. My wife grew up in Beverly Farms. We've been deeply ingrained in our community. We went to the public schools there. We're very active in our community associations. We volunteer really wherever we can. And we've got 3 young kids. And I would say, like the rest of Beverly, the neighborhoods that make up Ward 6 are unique, and it's really the people that are our greatest asset.
So, thinking a little bit about, you mentioned that you've served in the past. What's your approach to representing constituents, and what might be a little bit different about being a ward councilor in that way?
Yeah, I think, listen, local government is really the front line for residents. It's really all about constituent services and really understanding the needs and interests of the people that you represent. So work ethic, number one, being prepared, attending meetings, understanding what's on the agenda, what issues are coming up before voters, how your residents feel about those issues, I think is really important. So getting out there, attending meetings. I was always a hard worker as a city councilor at large. So I think number one, just being on the ground, being visible, and understanding the people that you represent, I'd say is really the biggest priority, and also being transparent, sharing information. I did my best to send out newsletters and use social media and host events to let people know what's going on and hear from them. So I think, they need to see their ward councilor, they need to know that you're there for them, and they need to know that you're able to help them out.
Yeah, so can you speak a little bit, you talked about a couple of ways that you let people know what's going on in city government. Do you find that city government is especially sort of accessible to people? And what ideas do you have for making that more of a two-way conversation? How would you make city government more accessible? Yeah,
so I think, government has tended to be a lagger in accessibility, right? And I think, as a city councilor at large, I was one of the first to really use social media in that way to let people know about that in Beverly. And I think for me, I think COVID has taught us that we can do things remotely, and it might be more accessible. I've participated in a number of city meetings virtually, which I think has been a big development. You don't have to go down to City Hall to attend a meeting. And when I was on the city council, it was always a rare sight to have people actually come to those meetings. And that was, I thought, unfortunate. I think BevCam provides an incredible service. But it's really up to the ward councilor, the city councilors at large, to let people know what's happening and being proactive. And again, I think, newsletters, events, being on the ground, talking to people, letting them know what's happening, and some people aren't going to be engaged. They're busy in their day lives. But when things that are big are coming up, give them a heads up.
Yeah, so let's then talk a little bit about what you are hearing from voters. What are some of the top issues you're hearing from folks in Ward 6? Yeah,
so it's interesting, as someone who ran previously, I'm always amazed that it's really the most local issues, I've been knocking on a lot of doors, and inevitably it's My sidewalk hasn't been repaved in 50 years. That road hasn't been repaved in 50 years. That playground equipment needs to be repaired. So, I think for me, it's really the local services that people rely on and impacts them every day. Public safety, repaving a sidewalk or a crosswalk, looking at traffic issues. These are the things that I hear about most when I'm out there door to door.
Yeah. And what's generally your approach to solving when those kinds of questions come up? How do you approach solving the issues that people bring to you?
Yeah, I think it's really engaging. If it's a sidewalk, going out, looking at it, taking pictures of it, and then looking to my colleagues in government, and whether it's fellow city councilors, whether it's the mayor's office, whether it's the appropriate department head in the city. Oftentimes the ward councilor can't solve problems themselves, but it's sort of escalating in getting folks to prioritize these issues. Sometimes it's working with folks at the state level. I have extensive experience at the state level, so it's understanding what services are out there that are available to people, whether it's a state entity or working with your state representative, Jerry Paracella or Joan Lovely. There are a number of tools, I think, that are available to a ward counselor, but I think first and foremost, it's understanding the issue, understanding whether it's something that can be solved at the local level, the state level, the federal level, and then making those connections and trying to escalate and prioritize those issues.
Yeah. So what other kinds of issues are you hearing outside of, my sidewalk needs to be fixed? What bigger picture issues?
Yeah, listen, I think the COVID-19 pandemic is obviously the elephant in the room. Everybody has been dealing with that over the last couple of years. It's impacted everybody in a lot of different ways. So I think that is a huge issue for our city moving forward. I think I was in a meeting just recently on money that the city is getting from the federal government or from ARPA funds. We're getting $12.6 million. That's a big issue. That's an opportunity. In that meeting, we heard from a lot of community organizations that were hurting, a lot of small business owners that were hurting. The Act provides a number of ways we can use that money, so I think we need to be thoughtful about exploring all those different avenues and really trying to address both immediate needs, but also thinking about, a couple years down the line, what makes the most sense. So I think the pandemic, issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion are obviously important to our society today and are a priority for Beverly. We've had a lot of impact in terms of housing and development in our community, so I think those are priorities as well, understanding what that impact has been. How does the pandemic change what our future plans might have been? I know there's been a big focus on transit-oriented development. Having worked at the MBTA, I know the commuter rail has been down. What does that look like moving forward? How does that impact our planning? So I think those are some of the issues. Again, education, public safety are always issues, I think, at the local level as well.
Yeah, I think you've just previewed a couple of questions that I'd love to ask. Yeah. I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into.
Sure.
But before we do that, you mentioned the ARPA funds. Beverly's making decisions about how to spend them. You're going to be in a position making some decisions about spending. What for you is the top priority for spending right now?
So I think first and foremost, I think it's important we have a transparent process, right? How are we going to use this money? How can residents, business owners, community organizations make their case, right? I think that it's important that we give them an opportunity to do that. And then, I think we need to have continue a conversation with all the stakeholders involved and how folks would like to see that. I've chatted with Brian Ailes, the city's finance director. I think we've weathered the COVID pandemic from a financial point of view relatively well. I think, when I was on the council, we had built out a stabilization fund that really came in handy, I think, during the pandemic. But listen, there are needs, there are impacts that are wide-ranging. And so I think first and foremost, I'd be focused on the process and making sure that it's transparent and that everyone has a seat at the table.
Okay. So you mentioned housing earlier. I want to ask a little bit more about development. I think Massachusetts has to provide housing for all of its residents,
Absolutely.
Right? That's a statewide issue. Lots of conversation about how we're going to possibly do that. Obviously that conversation also comes down to the local level. So I just want to ask you what your thoughts are. How much development do we do locally? Yeah. What kind, where, and sort of what's the why?
So I worked in the governor's office for Governor Charlie Baker, and this is a huge priority that he's led is in terms of the need for housing. He's identified hundreds of thousands of units across the state that he'd like to see built. I think Beverly has been a leader in sort of addressing that issue locally. But I think there also is a regional approach. What are other communities doing? What is appropriate for Beverly to take on ourselves versus our neighbors? And, again, we've done a lot in the last few years. I would like us to sort of take as as a new counselor, if I'm elected, I would like to see what has the impact been of that housing development. What has the impact been to our schools, to public safety, to our infrastructure, and then really think thoughtfully about what makes sense moving forward. I think there's been a series of master plans, and the mayor went around and made had community meetings on this. It was all done pre-pandemic. How has the pandemic impacted our needs? I think there are needs, no doubt. And I've supported a number of the developments that have taken place. But I also think it's probably time to evaluate what has the impact been, how's the pandemic changed things potentially, and what is our plan moving forward. And again, we're having those conversations. I've seen them happening, and I think we need to continue to do that. And again, bring stakeholders involved. This has been a big issue for our city. It's changing.
Yeah. And what would you say would be, so, I recognize the need to really involve the community in discussing those, but for you, Matt St. Hilaire,
sure.
I sort of wonder what's your take on it?
I think we've done a lot, and again, without having numbers in front of me, I would like to see what that impact has been, right? And how many new residents have we added? How many new children have we added to the schools? I hear from residents of Ward 6 who pay more in property taxes than anyone else. Where's the money going from all this development? So, as a counselor, I would really like to understand those answers to those questions before I say, yeah, we need to build another 6-story unit, right? I was looking at the Bass River meeting that recently took place, the opportunity to rezone that area and sort of unlock that for development, which has been on the books for a long time and I think is a positive thing. But the details of how we do that and what types of housing make sense there, I think are important. And I think for me, I'm not opposed to more housing, but I think it needs to be balanced. I need to understand what the impact is and that we have a plan moving forward to address those impacts.
Yeah, and what are your thoughts on Beverly? Is it economically accessible? I mean, we're talking about housing in particular. Do you find Beverly economically accessible? And
it's challenging, right? Costs are skyrocketing, and that's not just in Beverly, but across the board. And some of that's out of our control, but I do think we have a responsibility to ensure that folks that grow up here, who want to live here, who want to raise their families here, have an affordable opportunity to do that. But some of that is going to be out of our control, frankly.
Yeah, so we'll turn to a different topic. I think we've done a lot in Beverly in the last year or two to start having a conversation about racial justice and equity. You already mentioned that as a concern and an issue that a lot of people are thinking about. I think one of the things that we've certainly talked a lot about in community forums is the need for that issue not to be just sort of the job of one or two people in a city, but really as something that is owned by everyone. So sort of curious, how do you think about Ward 6, racial justice and equity, and how would you approach that? Maybe you can reference something that you've done to further that cause.
So I work in human resources. I was the chief human resources officer at the MBTA in sort of the wake of the George Floyd murder, and served on the diversity, equity, inclusion working group, and was sort of charged with helping to develop a work plan to address those issues. Currently in the private sector, also as a chief human resources officer, and are working on these issues every day. I've learned a lot. I think a lot of us have learned a lot about these issues and racial injustice. I would look to engage wholeheartedly in this work as a city councilor. I applaud the city's creation of the Race Equity Task Force and the appointment of a chief diversity officer. I think those are positive steps. In my experience, really is a three-pronged approach that I think I'd like to see us take, and one is around awareness, education, training, not just of city workers, but throughout our community. I look at, our workforce of our city. Is it representative of our community? And learned a lot about utilization of labor market, labor pools at the MBTA, and looking at, not just, what is the overall representation of the city, but teachers, for instance, what does the available workforce look like, and where do we fall? So there's a lot of data that I think we need to analyze there, and through that we'll start to see inequities and start to address strategies around that, around recruitment and outreach. And I think lastly, I think we need to acknowledge that a lot of ordinances, policies, procedures, traditions that have existed for decades were made in a different time, and I think a lot of them have, or some of them at least, have resulted in discriminatory results, and I think we need to explore those and again, identify areas where we can make change. And it's hard work. I found at the T, a lot of the things that we were looking at involved labor unions and collective bargaining and work rules and things that have existed for decades. And so it takes a lot of work to change that. And I would look to work with my colleagues and with everybody on that.
Okay. So, Beverly is a coastal community. I think we certainly have taken some steps as a city to address that, right, to become resilient. Do you think they've been the right steps? Are there others you think we should be taking?
I think we probably do more. I think we probably should do more. I know the mayor's been a leader on this. I know he's definitely been engaged from a climate perspective, climate change perspective, and in national organizations and looking what other communities are doing. I think on that issue, I would look to the budget. What are we spending? What is the plan? How are we addressing it through our values and through our budget priorities? I don't have all the answers on that issue. I think, but certainly more can be done.
Yeah. All right. So we've talked about a handful of different issues so far. I'm sure there are others that are priorities for you. I wonder, as you look at other cities, can you think of maybe something, an ordinance or an initiative another city has done that you think is especially pioneering that you'd like to see brought to Beverly?
Yeah, nothing's coming to mind. I don't have anything that comes to mind, but I think you've hit on a good point, which is we're not alone in this, in any of these issues, right? Other communities are fighting the same battles. When I was at the T, we looked at other transit authorities and what they were doing. I think that's important work. When I was on the council, I did a lot of that, but there's nothing I would say that's immediately come to mind that I would say that's something that they're doing that we need to do today. I haven't done a whole lot of research on what other folks are doing, but as a counselor, I think that's an important data point is, we're not in this alone. A lot of these issues aren't unique to us. How can we address them? What are other folks doing? What are some smart ideas that we can glob onto?
Yeah. And so we've talked about a lot of issues. Are there any that we haven't talked about that you think are actually really critical for the city to address, particularly in the wake of the pandemic that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think, infrastructure, right? And there are needs, roads, sidewalks, paving. I've talked to the mayor about water and sewer needs. That has to be on the table. And I think, there are a lot of sort of sexier issues, frankly, that are urgent and need addressing, but that is a core function of our city government, and I've heard from a lot of residents that they're frustrated that we're not keeping up with our needs there. So I think that's a big issue. Schools are always an issue. They're going through a lot right now. What do we need to support our schools? As a city councilor, I was fully engaged in trying to help move the schools forward. And public safety, again, is always an important local issue. Folks safe? Are they? Do the police have what they need to do what they're trying to do?
Yeah. So, that's a really helpful priority list, I think, for people to hear from you. What's sort of a tangible way that you as a city councilor would approach supporting schools? I think it's great to hear city councilors support schools, but what's the kind of tangibles for you as a ward?
Again, I would point to my track record, right? As a city councilor at large, one of the first issues I promoted was the elimination of the full day kindergarten fee. I was one of the first elected officials to really take that issue up. It wasn't necessarily it was a school committee issue, so to speak, but during the budget season every year, I made it a priority, and I said, I would rather fund, the elimination of the full day kindergarten than all these other items, and I proposed amendments to cut the budget and fund that every year. And so for me, it was about elevating the discussion and creating, the start of a momentum. Ultimately, it did get eliminated. I wasn't on the council when that happened, but I do take a lot of pride in being part of leading to that. And so I think for me, looking at some of those sort of issues, I was also someone who fought for smaller class sizes. So I would look to, what are the issues the school community is facing? What are, and how can I engage in that? How can I help out? Look to the PTOs, look to the school committee members. I've got 3 kids. Talk to my wife about what she's seeing, and obviously, as a city councilor, one of the benefits that you have is you have a platform, and you can use that platform to elevate issues. And I think I did that effectively as a city councilor at large, and I would look to do that again as a ward councilor.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear you, you've mentioned a couple of points of experience that you bring to the job. Would you share any other, sort of what you think of as your key points of experience, and then your values? I think it'd be really helpful for people to kind of get to know your operating values that you'd bring.
In terms of experience, my entire professional career has revolved around public service. I've worked in the governor's office for Governor Charlie Baker. I've worked at the MBTA, as I mentioned, as a chief human resources officer. I understand government. I understand, how agencies work, who's responsible for what at the local level. Obviously, I served as a two-term city councilor at large. I chaired the city's subcommittee on legal affairs and ordinances. I was served on the finance and property. I understand, how to get things done. I've worked and built relationships across both local and state government that I think are valuable. So from an experience point of view, I know how to get things done. I've been involved in understanding, what issues go where, and it's not easy. Government a lot of times takes a long time to get things done. Involves a lot of people coming together. So I think it's important to have strong working relationships, to be able to collaborate, form coalitions, and move something along. And sometimes, like I said, with the full day kindergarten fee, person that sort of starts it way down here may never realize and be the person that gets the credit at the end, but it's public service and the outcome is what's important, is sort of what I've learned. In terms of my values, I grew up in Beverly, attended Beverly Public Schools. My values really come from Beverly and from, my teachers and classmates and coaches. I'm a father, husband. Those are really my values. I think work ethic is something that I've always prided myself on. I do the job. I never missed a city council meeting. I'm transparent. What you see is what you get. Try to be upfront and honest with people. Can't always fix something, but telling people that I think is important. So that's a little bit about my values.
Right. And so I think in closing, I just really love to give you an opportunity to make your appeal directly to your neighborhood.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a big neighborhood. There's a lot of diverse people that live in it. So I just want to give you the opportunity to go ahead and make your appeal to your voters.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again to BevCam. To the residents of Beverly Farms, Centerville, and Pride's Crossing, you've been my biggest supporters over the years, and I am running for a couple of reasons. One, I'm passionate about public service. I care deeply about our community. Secondly, I think I have extensive experience in both the local and state level that will serve me well to be an effective ward councilor for you. And thirdly, we've got a lot of change happening on the council. We've got City Council President Paul Gawansi not running for re-election. We've got longtime City Councilor at large Tim Flaherty also not seeking re-election. We've got Stacey Ames in Ward 3 not seeking re-election. And I think, there's an opportunity for me to come in, bring some experience and balance to the council. As your city councilor, you can count on me to be someone who's going to work hard, never miss a meeting, be visible in our community, be accessible. I will always be responsive to your needs. And, listen, we've got a lot going on in this world. I think the experience that I bring to the table as both at the state level, as a former city councilor at large, relationships that I've developed over the years will enable me to serve you well. I'm working hard to earn your vote. Election is coming up on Tuesday, November 2nd, and I humbly ask for your vote.
And Matt, I want to thank you for joining us today. Really kind of you to make yourself available to voters. I want to thank everyone who's watching for making the time to get to know your candidates in Ward 6. I would invite you to come back and watch the other interviews. There will also be interviews for the other candidates in Ward 6 and Ward 3, as well as all of your candidates for the at-large City Council. You'll want to watch the screen to learn more about important dates and how to register to vote, how to be involved in your local election by voting. Again, thank you for joining us for conversations with the candidates, and tune in again to watch the rest of the interviews.